She commandeered the room in the basement of her dorm room as soon as she realized she would have to pull an all-nighter in order to prepare for tomorrow's final exam. Her roommate, Jenna, liked to get to bed early, so she packed up everything she thought she would need and went downstairs to study. And study, and study some more. It was 2 o'clock when she realized that she'd left one of the textbooks upstairs on her bed. With a dramatic sigh, she rose and climbed the stairs slowly to her third-floor dorm room. The lights were dim in the long hallway, and the old boards creaked under her weary tread. She reached her room and turned the handle as softly as she could, pushing the door open just enough to slip inside, so that the hall lights wouldn't wake her roommate. The room was filled with a strange metallic smell. She frowned a bit, her arms breaking out into chills. There was a strange feeling of malice in the room, as if a malevolent gaze was fixed upon her. It was a mind trick. The all-nighter was catching up with her. She could hear Jenna breathing on the far side of the room, a heavy sound, almost as if she had been running. Jenna must have picked up a cold during the last tense week before finals. She crept along the wall until she reached her bed, groping among the covers for the stray history textbook. In the silence, she could hear a steady drip, drip, drip sound. She sighed silently. Facilities would have to come fix the sink in the bathroom again. Her fingers closed on the textbook. She picked it up softly and withdrew from the room as silently as she could. Relieved to be out of the room, she hurried back downstairs, collapsed into an overstuffed chair, and studied until 6 o'clock. She finally decided that enough was enough. If she slipped upstairs now, she could get a couple hours sleep before her 9 o'clock exam. The first of the sun's rays were beaming through the windows as she slowly slid the door open, hoping not to awaken Jenna. Her nose was met by an earthly, metallic smell a second before her eyes registered the scene in her dorm room. Jenna was spread-eagled on top of her bed against the far wall, her throat cut from ear to ear, and her nightdress stained with blood. 2 drops of blood fell from the saturated blanket with a drip, drip noise that sounded like a leaky faucet. Scream after scream poured from her mouth, but she couldn't stop herself any more than she could cease wringing her hands. All along the hallway, doors slammed and footsteps came running down the passage. Within moments, other students had gathered in her doorway, and one of her friends gripped her arm with a shaking hand and pointed a trembling finger toward the wall. Her eyes widened in shock at what she saw. Then she fainted into her friend's arms. On the wall, above her bed, written in her roommate's blood, were the words, "Aren't you glad you didn't turn on the light?"
When I was about 12, my great-uncle John came from Ukraine to visit us in Canada. He had a lot of stories, but this was the one that stood out. In the late 1960s, John was traveling by train from his village to another to visit family. He had to change trains at one point, and was dropped off at what amounted to a platform in a hut in the middle of nowhere. There was no one else at the station, and other than a dirt road that led off into the surrounding woods, there was nothing there. He waited for some time, but no train came. It was winter, and getting colder and darker, and just about the time he started worrying about having a place to stay and some food to eat, an old woman appeared out of the twilight. She asked if he was waiting for such and such a train, and when he said he was, she said it wouldn't be along until the following day. She asked if he needed a bed for the night, and offered him a meal and a room at her place, which she said was about an hour's walk from the station. Lodging with locals was more or less the standard when travelling in this part of the USSR, and Great Uncle John wasn't looking forward to a hungry night on a cold platform, so he was glad to accept her offer. He took his suitcase, and they set off together down the dark road into the forest. It was more than an hour away, more like 2, and by the time they arrived at the woman's small 2-story house, John was tired and hungry. They went inside, and the woman lit some oil lamps and warmed some borscht for them. It was the first time John was able to see the woman clearly, and he was a bit startled to realize that the old woman was actually a man. Not wanting to pry, and too tired to care, John finished his soup and asked where he would be sleeping. She led him up the stairs to a tiny room with a window that contained a single bed and nothing else. He thanked her, they said goodnight, and she closed the door. Then she locked it, leaving him in the dark. Somewhat creeped out by this, John called to her, but she didn't answer, and he heard nothing. Figuring he would deal with it in the morning, and that she had probably done it by mistake, John set his suitcase down and laid on the bed, deciding to make the best of it and get some sleep. Before he could fall asleep though, he felt the urge to pee, and got out of bed, hoping to find a chamber pot or something he could pee in. He got onto his hands and knees, and began to feel under the bed in the darkness, thinking that's where the pot would be if there was one. Instead, he found a body. Great Uncle John went right to the window to see if he could exit the room that way. It was nailed shut. He knew that if he remained in the room, he was probably a dead man. But if he broke the window and tried to get out that way, there was a good chance that the old woman, and who knows who else was there, would hear him and come into the room before he could get away. So he did the only thing he could do. He pulled the body from under the bed, heaved it onto the mattress, and covered it with the blanket. Then he got under the bed and waited. Sure enough, about an hour later, he heard footsteps coming slowly up the stairs, and then towards the room. The lock clicked, and the knob turned slowly. In the gloom, John saw someone move towards the bed. He heard several terrific and sickening thuds. The person had bashed the body on the bed with a large crowbar, which they had then dropped on the floor right in front of John. There was silence. Then the person went out of the room, and the door was shut again. The footsteps went down the stairs, and then, once more, silence. John moved out from under the bed, took the crowbar, and was able to slowly pry the window open. He didn't say, but I imagine he was shitting bricks the entire time. When the window was up, he threw his suitcase out, then dove through himself, not caring what was below him, only worried about what was behind. He landed without too much injury, and began to run into a field behind the house, towards some lights in the far distance. It turned out to be a highway with some military and transport trucks on it, and John was able to get a ride to another village where he could catch a train. He didn't bother reporting what happened to the authorities, since at that time in the USSR, there was a distinct chance he would be the one who got into trouble. He just thanked God that he escaped, and decided that the next time he travelled to visit relatives, he'd take another way.
Last summer I came home to visit my parents and siblings. I usually spend my summers working for my university's housing, so I was really eager to get away from all that and spend a relaxing few months at home. My parents' house is in a decent neighborhood. Never had there been an instance of burglary or home invasions. It was a pretty quiet suburbia. I would even venture to say boring on some accounts. Anyway, last summer, the air conditioning was broken at our house, and my dad was going to have a repairman come by and check it out around 2 p.m., and he would leave work early to meet him. My mom and sisters were off to work and school, so I was at the house by myself. My room was upstairs. I took a nap and woke up to the sound of a door slamming at around 1:30. I didn't think anything of it because I thought it was my dad meeting the repairman a little early. I decided I'd go and join them to see what the damage was. I was eager to get the AC back because summers in Texas are awful. When I got to the second floor landing, I noticed something was off right away. It was dead silent. I heard my dad's gun cabinet open, the place where he kept his most prized guns. I thought it was strange, but my dad did love to chat and show off his things. I honestly had no clue what was going on. And then my cell phone rang in the bathroom next to my room. I was keeping it in there to charge because the outlet in my room was broken. It was my dad. He was calling to let me know that the repairman was coming at 3 instead of 2. Now, I've read where people talk about going cold all over when they're afraid, but at that exact moment, I felt like I was about to throw up everywhere. I was so scared, because whoever was downstairs was not my dad, and it apparently wasn't the repairman. I locked myself in the bathroom and told him what was going on. He promptly told me to call the police, and I did. The operator stayed on the line with me and said the officers that would arrive had a safe word they would tell me to assure it was actually them. I sat in the dark bathroom for what seemed like ages, my heart racing. Finally, there was a soft knock on the door. The man said it was the police and gave me the safe word, and I quickly ran out to meet them, almost hyperventilating. And in a flash, all of the police officers were training their guns on me. I held my hands up, freaking out, but they ushered me away from the door quickly. I didn't have time to ask questions because the officers turned on the bathroom light. Standing in the bathtub was a man, dressed all in black, clutching a knife. He was staring right at me. He was there the entire time.
I've always had an innate fear of the night. Not so much the dark, but the night itself. As a child, my imagination was overcome with stories of creatures that come alive at night and the safety offered by a house and light. I never had anything to base this fear on, until a night when I decided to go with a buddy of mine to a baseball game and got stuck at a light at 2 a.m. after dropping him off at home. Of course, that night, the game went into extra innings, and so I didn't get a chance to drop my friend off back home until well after 1 a.m. Everything was fine on the way home until I hit a light right before the street that led to my house. It was a T-junction, and I was turning left. The light is one of those that you think is broken until it finally turns green right when you finally decide to just run it. So, of course, I pulled up right as the light turned red. I would have just run the light, seeing as no one was there and it was closing in on 2 a.m. on a school night. But earlier that week I had heard the phrase, "Character is what you do when no one is looking," and for whatever reason, that was the night I decided to prove to myself that I was a man of character. Big mistake. I pulled to a stop at the light, feeling good about myself, bordering on self-righteous, when I happened to look out of my window to my left and noticed a lady sitting all alone on a bus bench. We made brief eye contact and I quickly looked away. It was too late. I could see movement out of my peripheral vision and knew she was coming my way. I looked out the window and noticed she was carrying a bag. I quickly checked that my doors were locked and that all my windows were up. I then moved my right foot above the accelerator just in case and braced myself for what was to come. I was hoping it would just be an awkward exchange and was praying for a quick light change before she reached me so I could just get out of there. But I knew there was a slim chance of that. She walked right up to my window, put down her bag, and began to tap on my window. I nervously looked up at her and she mentioned for me to put my window down. I had automatic windows, so I just imagined pushing too hard on the window button and that thing just coming all the way down. So I took a deep breath and lightly flicked it with my finger. The window moved microscopically down, but she didn't seem to notice or care. She then leaned in and began to talk. She said,
"My boyfriend beat me up. I have a friend who lives down the street. Can you give me a ride?"
I should stop and give you a brief physical description of the bag lady. She was small and skinny and kind of an indeterminate age. She was either in her mid-20s and had lived a hard 20-plus years on the street, or she was 60-something years old who had lived a moderately hard life on the street. All that to say, just by looking at her, there was no way to verify her story. She looked beat up by life, not just by a boyfriend. But there was something about her delivery. It was robotic and seemed practiced, like she was disconnected for the moment. That made my skin crawl. And after a brief, maybe about a second debate on whether I should do it, I told her that I had to get home and that I couldn't give her a ride. After my first refusal, she leaned in closer and said the same thing again.
"My boyfriend beat me up. I have a friend who lives down the street. Can you give me a ride?"
This time, I felt more confident when I declined to give her a ride and told her I had a curfew and had to get home. She leaned in a third time and began her statement again.
"My boyfriend beat me up."
At this point, the light changed and I slowly lifted my foot off the brake and started slowly rolling forward and began muttering an apology. She didn't move. She just looked at the light, looked down at me, leaned in closer, and said 5 words that have haunted me ever since.
"You made the right decision."
Then she picked up her bag and walked back towards the bench. I peeled out of the intersection and cried and screamed all the way home. I have no idea what she planned to do or if there were more people waiting to jump in my car from the bushes had I moved to let her in. But that encounter has haunted me ever since, and has confirmed in my mind that nothing good happens after dark.